Today, come on in. Today we are going to be hearing from Professor Beata Stawarska, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Oregon. Her primary research interests revolve around problems of sociality, embodiment, gender, and language. She approaches these questions by drawing on a number of philosophical traditions: phenomenology, structuralism and post-structuralism, feminism, the dialogical tradition, and she seeks to combine reflective and empirical approaches whenever possible. Stawarska engages contemporary authors such as Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Beauvoir, Buber, and Levinas, J.L. Austin, Derrida, Bourdieu, Kristeva, Irigaray, Butler, and, most recently, The Philosophy of Language by Ferdinand de Saussure. Stawarska's first monograph, Between You and I, Dialogical Phenomenology, was published by the Ohio University Press in 2009. As a recipient of the 2009-11 Humboldt Fellowship for Advanced Researchers at the University of Heidelberg, which we just heard about, Stawarska completed her second book, Saussure's Philosophy of Language as Phenomenology, Undoing the Doctrine of the Course in General Linguistics, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. As an Oregon Humanities Center 24-25 research fellow, Stawarska is working on a project titled De Anima, L.S. Senghor's Force, Ontology, and Animism. And that is the topic of her talk today. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here, and to the Humanities Center again for supporting this work. It's been such a privilege and such a joy to be immersed in Senghor's writings over the course of this term, and I only wish it could go on forever, but it won't. So I have prepared so much, and I'll probably have to skip some things, but I'll get right to it, and if I don't get to anything, I'll be happy to come back to whatever I wasn't able to cover during the Q&A. So I want to open with a brief origin story of the talk itself, because I initially conceived this project just a little bit differently than what I'm actually currently doing. So my initial focus was on just the theoretical humanistic essays authored by Leopold Sédar Senghor from the Liberté or Freedom series. There's 5 volumes. Volumes 1, 3, and 5 are devoted specifically to humanistic theory, and my goal was and still is to translate some of these essays and to develop an interpretation of force ontology that Senghor develops within these lively theoretical as well as technical texts. Only a fraction has been translated into English at this stage, so I'm contributing to the translation effort and to, together with other colleagues, rekindling interest in this body of work. However, this term, this is kind of like a bird's eye overview of my desk currently, I realized by reading more broadly in Senghor's corpus that he is addressing questions related to philosophy, to ontology, not only in the sense of strict theoretical texts, but also, unsurprisingly perhaps, in his, so there's theory, but there's also poetry. There are folk tales that Senghor either engaged with coming out of West Africa, or that he himself wrote, like the one with Le Lièvre, the one with an hare on the cover. There are works of biography and autobiography where he speaks about his philosophical interest and his own commitment, immersion in animism. And so I realized that to do kind of justice to the question, which is the understanding of being, West African understanding of being in terms of forces, I have to read more broadly. The project has to be a multi-genre reading of Senghor's force ontology across this body of work. So it's still a humanistic project, but I'm conceiving it more broadly than I did initially. I'm a theory girl, so initially I was interested in theory, but I just realized that that theory and literature and poetry and folktales are all intermeshed, and so I kind of have to read them together, just as Senghor is a multi-genre author who wasn't just a theorist, even though I think it's important to recognize him as such. So that's kind of the state of my work, of my research currently, and I want to open by talking about the dominant reception of Senghor's work, especially in the field of philosophy, and then what my contribution is. I'll focus on the third point because it's most directly related to the project, but I'll briefly mention the other two. So you may have heard Senghor being charged with racial essentialism, which is perhaps strategic, perhaps not, right? Using this kind of homogeneous category of le nègre, the Negro, that doesn't do justice to diversity of Black people across the globe. Fanon is perhaps most famously raised this charge. There is a charge of political kind of impotence or apolitical culturalism, of putting culture above revolutionary political action, and so Senghor has been challenged, right, in his efforts to prioritize or revitalize West African cultural and religious traditions, again, perhaps most famously by Fanon. And then thirdly, related to these, the first two is the worry about Fanon's complicity with French colonialism, but now raised especially to the philosophical tradition of force ontology as it was developed by European Africanists, like perhaps most famously Plessis Temples. This critique was developed especially by Aimé Césaire and in Cameroon by Fabien Eboussi-Boulaga. And so if it's true that Senghor's own understanding of being in terms of forces, in terms of movement, is very close to temples, and by extension kind of falls under an attachment to France and to Europe especially, right? He would be guilty by association to this decolonial critique. And so my question in this project is whether Senghor is in fact guilty by association, or whether when you're reading his works closely, when you're reading the entire corpus in the original, does a different kind of force ontology emerge there? So, if you haven't heard about it yet, I want to say a couple of things about what this Belgian school of Bantu philosophy is, like, as I call it here, what it's about, how it was critiqued, and then address the question of where Senghor's own thinking fits. And so. The argument developed by Plessis Temples, whose original book cover you can see in this kind of grayish, with this grayish background, Bantu philosophy in Flemish now. It was a book published in 1945 where Temples, who was a Belgian missionary working in the then Belgian Congo, authored this book titled Bantu Philosophy, and developed the idea that the Bantu people of the Belgian Congo, but also people of the entire southern projection of the continent of Africa, and then by extension, because he generalized very quickly, by extension all Africans, and by extension all other primitive, as he called them, meaning non-European peoples, understand being in terms of vital force, so kinetically, dynamically, rather than the way that the Europeans do, which is in terms of a substance or a thing endowed with attributes. Right, that's the basic argument from the book Bantu Philosophy, 1945. Now, it's important when reading the book, which was very influential in its time and rekindling the field of African philosophy and of establishing it as a recognizable field. It's also important to note, as Temples' critics did. So here's a couple of kind of more critical provisos, that Temple says he was a holy man, right? He was a missionary. He wasn't a professional philosopher. So his training, academic training, his major interests were really in religion religion, not in philosophy, as, for example, Mudimbe in his book, The Invention of Africa notes, right? So the little philosophy that temples would have been familiar with was Aristotelianism, scholasticism, not the philosophy chosen by Senghor himself, which is philosophie moderne, contemporary philosophy, existentialism, phenomenology, especially. So temples would have preferred these Aristotelian grids that distinguish clearly between ontology, a study of being on the one hand, and morality, a study of what is good, what is a good life on the other hand, right? He was interested first and foremost in establishing what a first philosophy is, right? Ontology, a study of being itself, which is presumably morally neutral. Temples was also part of the Thomist tradition. So as Nadia Kisukidi, for example, reminds us, he believed that philosophy really serves theology, right, and practically serves the missionary effort to know the Bantu mind so that to colonize it spiritually, right, so that to promote Christian evangelism, right. And finally, scholasticism is very much part of this. The Belgian school, you can see it in temples as much as in Leo Apostles' book, African Philosophy, Myth or Reality, where they kind of break down Bantu philosophy, so-called, to a system of principles that would be based on a rational and logical relation between the knower and the world. And so if this all makes sense, let me know if I'm going too fast. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Good, awesome. So now let's see more concretely as to what the scholastic or an Aristotelian grid looks like as far as Bantu philosophy is concerned. So Apostle puts forward these 7 principles of Bantu or Belgian Bantu philosophy, and I will be focusing on just the last 2, number 6 and 7. The universe is a hierarchy of forces organized according to their strengths, starting from God and going down to the mineral, through the founding ancestors, the important dead, living humans, animals, and plants. And number 7, direct causal action involves the influence of more being or stronger force on less being or weaker force. And so we can glean from these last 2 principles that there is this fixed hierarchy in place from the higher down to the lowest beings. And even though we're talking about a force ontology, so an ontology that is about forces, movements, right, processes, the hierarchy itself is supposed to be immutable, unchanging, established once and for all, God-given, perhaps. And then number 7 tells us that yes, there is movement, but the kind of the direct causal action always operates in a top-down manner, from a higher force to a lower force. Presumably, a reverse causal action is excluded, in principle. And so these 2 principles I will be challenging by looking closely at Senghor's own writings. But before we get to Senghor, I want to mention, because it's such an important, influential decolonial critique of temples, of this Belgian Bantu philosophy, that I'm taking seriously, and I'm considering whether it extends to Senghor's work or perhaps not quite. And so scholars like Ebussi Boulaga from Cameroon argued critically in relation to temples, in relation to apostle, that it's a very reductive philosophical framework which reduces the Muntu, human being in the African condition, to this presumably amoral, deterministic order of forces. Mudimbe, again, in The Invention of Africa, reiterates Aimé Césaire's radical question about this presumed structural similarity between, on the one hand, this simulacrum, right, this European fantasy or projection of a fixed ontological hierarchy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the de facto socioeconomic hierarchy that exists in the colonial experience, right? So how convenient to have an ontological hierarchy, right, when you are in the midst of the colonial conquest of Africa. Temples himself writes, this is now citing from the book Bantu Philosophy, that they quote, the white man, a new phenomenon in the Bantu world, could be conceived only according to the pre-existing categories of Bantu thought. He was therefore incorporated into the universal forces, and as such he was an elder, a superior human force, surpassing the vital force of all Africans combined. Right? The vital force of the white man is such that against it, the application of active natural forces at the disposition of Africans was without effect. So here now we see the hierarchy in the colonial context, right? The hierarchy as a justification of the colonial conquest. And so as M.S. Césaire importantly said in the Discourse on Colonialism, this ontology developed by Temple's conveniently integrated white Europeans at a very high level, and so it consecrates the religious, social, and economic subjugation of the Bantu by the Belgians, de facto. Right? And the question that I want to raise is what is the relation between Temples and Apostles, this crypto-colonial, if not overtly colonial project on the one hand, and Senghor's own force ontology, right? Since they are typically considered to be related. And so when asking this question, I'm drawing, of course, on pre-existing scholarship. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants like Suleiman Bashir Diagne, who authored this important book, African Art as Philosophy, Senghor, Bergson, The Idea of Negritude, where he perhaps for the first time in the Anglophone context develops the idea that Senghor was in fact a philosopher of art, especially African art is a form of philosophy. He's developing this idea of force ontology or vitalism, especially in relation to Bergson. Right, and so as a result, Diagne considers Senghor to be very much situated and influenced by the European philosophical theoretical context, and so he considers Senghor's relation to Temples' work to be positive, to be, as he describes it, an overflowing enthusiasm, thereby perhaps unwittingly making Senghor kind of guilty by association and vulnerable to the decolonial critique. More recently, Sheikh Thiam, who published this year Epistemologies from the Global South, argues that actually Diagne's critique must be completed by a more Africa-centered reading. Senghor's philosophy is profoundly rooted in African tradition. So rather than looking at Senghor as a follower of Bergson, as somebody who is trying to kind of complement Temples' Bantu philosophy by adding perhaps more detail to it, Thiam believes that we should situate Senghor's thinking in the context of his own life and of his own reflection, and then we'll see that he's actually doing things quite differently. And so my project is very much a response to Thiam's call for an Africa-centered reading, and that's something that I'm developing currently in my own project. So I'm developing an Afrocentric but also scholarly reading of Senghor's corpus, right? So the goal isn't just to simply turn the tables back and rather than practicing Eurocentrism, right, advocate Afrocentrism. The goal is to be scholarly, to be really steeped in his body of work and in the existing secondary literature, to know more about the context of his writing, so that we can hopefully make a strong case for the ways in which Senghor's force ontology is tied to, especially as I'll argue, Serer animism, to a conception of art in Serer culture, such that when he's speaking about forces, he is doing so in a way reflective of these traditions. And so here is my argument. Since we're philosophers, we like to be putting forward clear arguments. So here it is. I'm arguing that Senghor's vitalism is actually undecipherable without considering his engagement with West African culture, especially Serer animism. Excuse me. My evidence for this comes from his writings in Ontology Negre, so in Black African philosophy or ontology, everything related to the philosophy of negritude. But it also comes from his writings about religion, so his reflections on Serer animism, as well as his own engagement in the mystical elements of Serer animism, and thirdly, his writings on art, which I don't think I'll be able to get to today, but we'll see how much time we have. So I'm also making a case that Senghor's understanding of art is very much steeped in animist traditions, and that his own art, his own poetry, is a reflection thereof. And so what I'm hoping to establish based on this is that Afrocentric vitalism and the way that Senghor is developing it in his body of work does not really involve a steep hierarchical worldview, does not really entail this complicity with colonialism. I don't really see a discipleship stance towards philosophies developed by European Africanists in his work. Okay, so here now to Senghor's own philosophy, finally. So what is, you may have been wondering, well, what is this force ontology? What is this vitalism? So let me share with you a definition that Senghor develops in his own writings. This is in the first volume of Liberté. He says that this ontology identifies being with life, more precisely with vital force. Life is but an expression of vital force. So we see here the vitalist tradition, right, being embraced, the primacy of life, vita, hence vitalism. Furthermore, Senghor understands this force ontology to be a unitary or integrated kind of philosophy because it includes everything that's in the universe, right? God, spirit, humans, animals, minerals in your iPhone are included. The earth is included, right? And everything is connected to. So Achille Mbembe has this wonderful book, came out in 22, I believe, The Earthly Community, where he establishes a connection between what he calls a temporary techno-animism and ancestral animism, kind of making animism very much alive for us and relevant for us today. And a definition that Mbembe provides is simply but beautifully, there is nothing passive in the world, right? And Senghor now, kind of the second important element of his ontology is that the human, or what he calls, in agreement with the existentialist tradition and philosophy that he often refers to, so the human is an existent, and the human seeks to augment its own force by free action. Right, so our force is endowed with liberty or freedom, which is why this vitalism is also a form of humanism in agreement, Senghor emphasizes, with contemporary thought, with 20th century existential philosophy. And so here's a quote I find helpful to illustrate this ontology. He writes that, this is in volume 5 from Liberté, Black African ontology is unitary and existential. The entire system is founded on the notion of vital force. God gave vital force not solely to humans, but also animals, plants, and minerals. Yet the vocation or goal of this force is to grow. Hence the place the human occupies in the system as far as an existent that is a living being capable of augmenting its force and increasing its freedom within a cohesive community. The growth of the human, the center of the visible world, leads necessarily to the growth of the entire system, the growth even of God, from whom force emanates and who accomplishes it. So it's a fascinating citation where we get the definition of force ontology, but already we get the sense that the human isn't just a lower being situated within a certain rung within this fixed hierarchy, right? But the human is both receiving the vital force and is contributing to the growth of it across the entire universe, including the growth of God. right? The highest being depends on our actions. So I would say that it's an upward action of the so-called lower human, or the lower being, in this case the human being, to a higher, if not the highest being, is in fact possible, right? It's perhaps the norm, according to Senghor. I want to talk a little bit more about force ontology and how it connects to animism, but also surrealism and supernaturalism. These are all terms that Senghor uses in his descriptions. And so now looking at the first volume, these are all my translations, by the way. This is a text dealing more specifically with religion, but it's of a philosophical nature as well. So Senghor writes that the African, kind of speaking quite generically perhaps, is moved by the surreal aspect of the world. By surreal, he means what is greater than or above real, but not separate from it. Right? It's like an expansion of the depth of the real that is perhaps not immediately perceivable. So, for example, it's water insofar as it purifies, fire insofar as it destroys, the bush that burns and regrows signifies death and life. The external aspect is but the sign of the essence of an object. One abandons oneself to the object, assimilates it, but does not dominate it. It's an attitude that he elsewhere compares to an attitude of communion, right? So here we have this dimension of the surreal, supernatural, what is beyond the immediately perceivable kind of sense data, right, that empiricist philosophy talks about. But importantly, the surreal, supernatural is very much part of this intrinsic symbolism of the natural world, right? It's not an otherworldly domain, it's in this here world that symbols exist. Another citation that develops the former tells us that what precedes can be explained by Black animism. The world is not in its reality a sum of colors, shapes, and smells. For the African, beneath the material and sensible aspect, there is a world of souls, un monde d'âme. And what is a soul? What is the anima? African ideas on the soul are extremely nuanced and vary in detail from one people to another. We can say that it is a spiritual force, a principle of intellectual and moral life, which animates, importantly, every being, every plant, everything is endowed with its own character, right? It could be a mountain, a cave, a rock, or a lake. So anima, here we see the soul, right, in fact can be used interchangeably with vital force. It's the animus. It is what moves everything. It's what connects everything with everything else in the universe. It's not a solely human principle at all, right, because it goes down to the pebble. It goes down to the most sort of humble, seemingly elements of the world. They're part of this interconnected system of vessels, as he calls them, sometimes as well, right? And so everything lives. Right? Everything has a soul. The star, the animal, the plant, the stone. This is, he writes, Black animism. So hopefully we can see how the vitalism of force ontology actually morphs into or can be read equivocally with animism. Right? They seem to be interchangeable for Senghor.
Is it one soul per thing?
I believe every entity that it has a persona or is an individual has its unique soul. Mm-hmm.
But at the same
But
time,
they're interconnected. But
Yes,
they all
yes,
and they
yes.
act one upon the other.
Okay, so they're all
and
interconnected.
they're all interconnected and they are affected by one another. Right. So one's force could be augmented or it can diminish. Right, one force can be acted upon by another force, right? So it's, the entire system is very moving, fluid. It's alive, right? It's not just a conglomerate or an aggregate of pre-existing kind of monads, like in some Western metaphysics. Really. So I want to give you all another kind of way of thinking about this force ontology, vitalism, animism, but now looking at Senghor's engagement with West African folk tales that I've been reading with great delight this fall term as well. Senghor wrote at least 2 essays dealing with Senegalese folk tales, and he took them very seriously. He took them as an expression of especially Serer culture, but also of its philosophy. And I want to focus on just one tale called The Boli, which Senghor tells us is an illustration of animist customs. And we see here to your right a representation of the actual figure of the Boli, a photograph of the Boli held by Zanke and men from the Bambara community. So you have a visual, and I want you to think now about a very entertaining, fantastical story where the main character, who is an aging blacksmith, one day brings back his beloved Boli statue from the sacred forest. The Boli houses ancestral spirits, and so he brings it home. He venerates it from his own home by, as a good Serer man would, by giving it offerings of chicken blood, of sour milk, and by praying to it. And so one day he is rewarded. He's old. He's getting old. He's having a hard time working in his shop as a blacksmith. And so one day the Boli, or more specifically its shadow, morphs into a strong young man who is, as Birago Diop, the author of the tale, writes, the strong young man is hired on the spot, is helping out in the shop, but because of his supernatural powers, he's also able to bring back youth to the aging villagers. So one day there's this older woman who comes into the shop and complains of his old age. The young man, endowed with these superpowers as he is due to his ancestral origins, throws her in the fire, waits for her bones to be fully charred, then pours sour milk onto the charred bones, and voila, here she is, as beautiful and young as she was on her wedding day, to the amazement of her husband. So it's a story, right, that serves as it's a work of art. Needless to say, it's pure joy to read, but it also it's also a moralizing tale, which shows you that if you venerate the ancestral spirits, if you offer them sacrificial offerings, you will be rewarded, right, with these supernatural gifts. That's sort of the morale of it. Now, looking at Senghor's own engagement with the tale, like the Boli and others in the collection, he writes, quote, "There are no borders in Black Africa, not even between life and death. The real acquires its depth, becomes truth by breaking the rigid frameworks of logical reason, by enlarging itself into the extendable dimensions of the surreal," right? And the figure of the Boli and its superpowers is, I think, a great example of this kind of enlargement into the extendable dimensions of the surreal that we notice in reality itself. The Black African surrealism is a cosmological naturalism, meaning that the entire visible and invisible universe is composed of communicating vessels, of interdependent vital forces. Since the human force is endowed with freedom, it is capable of augmenting its vital force or diminishing it by negligence, but this can only be done by putting other forces to action or by letting them act on oneself, right? So by praying to the Boli, offering its sacrificial offerings, one is putting this superpower to action, which can then act upon other people, right? Like the older villager whose youth was restored, for example, right? This is how these forces are interdependent, interconnected, and act one upon the other. And in conclusion, Senghor writes, this is the postface to Birago Diop's tales, that it is not true that realism is the best way of expressing reality, right? Because realism often captures the mundane, the ordinary, the predictable, the measurable, right? And furthermore, realism it assumes that human reality, the human reality is sort of fixed and predetermined, right? Replaces human action, as I put in here, with a mechanical determinism, which confirms the bourgeois view that the current order of things is unchanging, right? And Senghor is interested in the ways that human action actually transforms, sometimes radically, the world of reality, because the world of reality always has this expendable, right, a supernatural dimension to it, not in heavens, but on this here earth. I want to now spend a little bit of time talking about the role of animism, kind of now construed as a cultural phenomenon in Senegal in the way that Senghor understands it, and talk a little bit about the importance of animism in his own life. So animism vivant, animism for Senghor is the original African religion. Within animism, the African subject exercises, and Senghor thinks that the subject should exercise, its function of an animator, of even a creator of life. Right? This is in agreement with a kind of European-style existentialist humanism, but it is also very much a reflection of the animist worldview. Animism means that the soul or the anima, rather than the intellect, makes us human. That doesn't mean he notes that the intellect itself is banished, but rather that animism was the especially productive principle of our civilizations, often at the root of genuine Black Renaissance. The old struggle, he notes, between Islam, Christianity, and animism continues on African soil today. Right? And so it's interesting that on the one hand, for Senghor, animism is of near extinction due to the de facto prevalence of Islam and Christianity in Senegal, right? But at the same time, Senghor insists on its centrality despite its de facto minoritized presence. So, for example, he writes that the culture of animism still has a hold in Senegal. It's the only cult that unifies all the Senegalese people. Right? And so there is a popular saying in Senegal, that the population is 95% Muslim, 5% Christian, and 100% animist. Right? And Senghor himself, right? So there's the official religion, and then there is the actual practice, the actual traditional beliefs, right, that people adhere to. And Senghor himself said, I was 100% animist, even though we know him officially as a Catholic. Right, so I was very intrigued by this, right? By this 100, but by being an animist 100%. What does it mean? And for Senghor, this means many things. He, in the series of interviews with Mohamed Aziza, he said to Aziza that Senghor lived in an animist milieu until he was about 7 years old. He refers to his uncle Wali, the important maternal uncle who was responsible for his moral and religious education. So not his father and his father's side of the family, but the mother's side. And again, here is where he says that I was 100% animist, right? My entire intellectual, moral, religious universe was animist. And oftentimes scholars kind of focus on this kingdom of childhood, right, notion that Senghor was raised as an animist and perhaps refers to this kingdom of childhood in his poetry. But Senghor himself actually said to Aziza that I do not place this kingdom solely at the beginning of my life. I also place it at the end. I will say more generally that the ultimate goal of human activities is to recreate the kingdom of childhood. Right? So we have this notion of a kingdom of childhood, but also the kingdom come, right? Something that, an order, a worldview that Senghor seeks to restore through his poetry, through his writing, and through his action, perhaps, as well. Right? Here we have an image of the Sine and Saloum Delta, where the Serer people lived and where Senghor was raised. So his poetry is definitely an expression of the kingdom of childhood. So in a postface to one of the collections of poems, Éthiopique, Senghor states that all the beings and things that my poems evoke are from my canton, right? So from the Serer villages, lost among the salt flats, lost among channels or arms of the sea, in the delta of the Sine and Saloum rivers and the fields, right? All I had to do is name them to relive the kingdom of childhood. And then he goes on to say that he lived in this kingdom. He says, I saw with my own eyes, right? Heard with my ears the fabulous beyond the things, right? The dead of the village and the ancestors who spoke to me, who initiated me into the alternate truths of night and day. So it's there's this proximity, the intimacy with the ancestors, with the dead, with all kinds of fabulous beings that he's talking about, right? They're not in an otherworldly domain, they're right here in the towns, in the villages, in the sacred forest. Right, and so all I had to do was to name these things to prophecy the city of tomorrow in my poetry, he concludes, right? That's the goal of that's his poet's mission, he tells us. And then here is one of the poems where we see Senghor address his uncle Wali, who was his kind of master in Serer traditions, who explained to him the signs spoken by the ancestors and constellations as serene as the sea. And towards the end of this citation from the much longer poem, he addresses the night to receive, again, the eternally childlike child who has not aged, right? So we see this, the way in which the kingdom of childhood was a kingdom that Senghor inhabited throughout his entire life. And my final example is from Sheikh Thiam's book, where Sheikh Thiam actually traveled fairly recently to Senegal, interviewed some of Senghor's family members, and there's all these interesting anecdotes about Senghor's kind of immersion into the mystical aspects of the Serer animism. There's a fascinating story where Senghor it travels in the middle of the night to Joal, wakes up his poor grandmother, makes her jump in the jeep and drive him into the thick of the forest, asks her to remember where a particular tree is, so that the following day she can sacrifice a spotless bull on the exact spot of this tree. All right? And here's a question, like, why? What is the purpose of this sacrifice? And he tells his grandmother, if you perform it, I shall not lose an election as long as it has green leaves. She made the sacrifice for him, and voila, he has not lost a single election ever since. So there you go. Right? 45 years old, so clearly no longer a child, a politician, right? Who is still very much immersed and committed to the animist mystical worldview. Okay. So my final item I want to share with you today, and then I'll pause because I know that I'll probably be out of time, is about the relation between vitalism understood as a philosophy, but also as a religion, right? This will probably not come as a surprise because we've been talking about vitalism as animism, but I want to share with you some reflections by Senghor as to what the exact relation between philosophy and religion is, okay? So he actually stated that African philosophy is lived in practice. It is religion. African philosophy is religion. It isn't just a question of knowing, right, with the intellect. of certain truths of the life behind appearances, but rather, first of all, of living it practically and by anticipation in our earthly life, right? So it's a practice as well as a doctrine, you could say. And he says so here. We have a kind of a more technical definition where Senghor states that a religion is two things. It has an ideational component. So it's an ensemble of ideas comprising a doctrine, such as the one we have in the citation below. But importantly, it is also the manifestation of this doctrine within worship, within a given practice, right? Which is why you cannot really access this philosophy, aka religion, by purely intellectual knowledge, by just reading from the books, right? You have to live it, you have to practice it, right? And so it's an ensemble of various ritual acts like prayers and sacrifices. He says there is an artistic element to it too. So in the longer version of the talk, I talk about the arts as well as religion. So prayers and sacrifice, music and dance, and masquerade, right? These are all ways of performing your religion, of performing force ontology, right? Of not only speaking about force, but living within its reach. And the final thought I want to share with you is that this force ontology, which he says is the dogma of African religion, is tied to worship specifically expressed by the sacrifice. And so I was very intrigued by what Senghor means by this exactly, and why is sacrifice so important for him as a way of practicing force ontology. And so I want to share some thoughts with that, and then I'll conclude. And perhaps I'll skip that. So I've been reading broadly about the role of sacrifice in Serre Animism, especially by Henri Gravron, who argues that the worship is a propitiatory practice, right? It serves to render natural forces propitious. The prayer, unlike in Christianity or Islam, is not sufficient, it's not efficacious enough, right? But you have to offer the vital forces of the sacrificial matter, such as, right, your vital fluids like blood or milk or vegetable sap, right? You're offering it to give your communion real efficacy, right? That's the ontological realism of sacrifice, according to Gravron. And we can think about how the Catholic communion is actually a form of sacrifice. That would be an interesting conversation to have. Janice Spliff has written interesting things about that. But now back to Senghor and force ontology. So the sacrifice for Senghor is, he considers it to be the cardinal example of the general law of interaction of forces in the universe. The cardinal example of the general law of interaction of forces in the universe. If you want to understand force ontology, you have to understand what is the meaning of the sacrifice. Right? Don't just read temples. So here's a good quote that helps us to, I think, understand it better. So he writes that the ancestors are dead. They are the oldest human expression of God. They no longer have a body and the vital spirit or breath. Now, to not be completely dead, parfaitement mort, the ancestors must augment vital forces together with the living humans, the existence. The one performing the sacrifice, who is the oldest in the community and therefore closest to the ancestors, participating already in their condition, offers the sacrificial nourishment to the ancestor, right? It's a form of feeding the ancestors, right? Giving them vitality, energizing them, activating them, right? And in exchange, the ancestor transmits its vital force via the one performing the sacrifice to the entire community. The sacrifice constitutes the essential act of the Black African religion, whose dogma is captured, again, by the existential and unitary force ontology offered here. Right? So it's a fascinating, I think, exchange that we witness here between the forces, right? The humans provide the force of a kind of the vital juices that nourish the ancestors who kind of live this shadowy existence, and in exchange, right, they will be activated. They will be ready to unleash their superpowers and perhaps help steer the reign in the direction of the humans, right? Assist in their affairs in whatever way is propitious, right? That's the idea. And so the philosophical point I want to tease out from this is that God and the ancestors who are and the demigods who are semblables à Dieu, kind of godlike, they may be all powerful, right? They clearly have these superpowers that ordinary humans, do not have, right? But importantly, these artificial ancestral spirits depend vitally upon these sacrificial rituals and these sacrificial offerings, right? Involving lower beings. It's the humans, right? The older family member typically, right, who is going to offer animal blood, vegetable sap, right, sour milk, so these juices of the earth, of the animals, of the plants, to nourish the ancestors, energize them, activate them, right, get the connected fluid vessels to be interacting again, right? And so the latter, so the plants, animals, and humans can in fact lend life to these invisible incorporeal beings, which suggests that there is no steep hierarchy, right, from the highest to the lowest again, but more of an interaction, a reciprocal interaction between all the elements involved. And so finally, okay, I'll skip this part.
Yeah, just so you know, we have about 5 more minutes, and I'm sure people want to ask questions.
No, for sure, and I realize I may be over time, so this is my conclusion. That the Afrocentric multi-genre reading of Senghor's Forest Ontology, in my interpretation, calls for a revision of the 2 concluding principles of that we read from Apostle and Temples, right? So we should say that Forest Ontology allows for, it even necessitates an energetic reciprocity between spiritual and earthly beings that challenges any immutable and violent top-down hierarchy. And number 7 would state that the action of lesser on greater beings is not only possible, but in fact it seems to be the norm, because living humans engage in direct causal action, and even the lowest beings, like we talked about, animals, plants, the soil itself, the earth itself, right, is implicated in the process. We can see it in the worship, we can see it in art making as well. So we have this multi-directional interplay of forces without a preordained kind of top-down ordering when we actually read Senghor closely. So thank you. And this is my question from Senghor for you all.
Well, what you've
excuse
described.
me, I think we had a conversation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for your work as a translator, because it is undervalued but indispensable, so thank you for that. I was wondering, because also you've worked on this as well, if you would have, or if you've had encountered 2 issues with Senghor. One being, maybe I would think of Ojerunkia Yayumi reading and saying, well, maybe there is a kind of maybe an affinity with colonialism, but it's in gender, right? It's in what have you found, if you found any kind of issues related to gender, because I think like a lot of course, African feminists, right? That has also been a kind of deep critique of both Fanon and like male black African philosophers as well, from the part of black feminists in the African tradition as well. So if you have anything to say that, and he mentions like modern philosophy, right? And so I'm wondering also if you have also seen this kind of maybe a critical engagement with Spinoza, right? Because to me, what is closer, I would say, like you see a lot of understanding of expression, force, right? Unity, system, and that is kind of more. Even, of course, you don't want to make it also Western again, but like his engagement, right, with modern philosophy, particularly Spinoza, that I find to be kind of in deep affinity, of course, with differences, right, to what he's saying.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. So maybe I'll start with with the second one. So I was thinking very much about Spinoza when putting together this presentation, especially because I think that, like Spinoza, Senghor develops a monistic metaphysics. There is no separation between spiritual and material things, right? There are no facets of this one all-encompassing reality. So I would say that because for Senghor, what he calls supernatural, surreal, is in fact intimately tied with the natural, with the real, right? He's a monist, if we want to use that category. I would also say that Senghor is an ontological energetist, if that's a word, right? So there's this focus on life, on energy, on exchanges between energies, on the way that these exchanges, right, transform the parties involved. I haven't found that in Spinoza myself. I'm not a scholar of Spinoza. So I guess what I would say is I think on the surface, yes. But I think that Senghor's thinking is much more interdisciplinary. It's very much situated in African realities. Perhaps Spinoza is situated in Jewish mysticism as well. So I think the mystical connection is there. So I would acknowledge the relation without kind of wanting to conflate them either. Yeah. And as far as the gender, that's honestly an open question for me, because I wasn't initially reading Senghor through the lens of gender. I was understanding him to make generic claims about humans, as free agents who can either augment our force or through resignation, depression, and so on, kind of resign ourselves and let our forces sort of, wither. I realize now that gender is an important element of kind of deciding, who actually becomes initiated in Sarah Animism. These are male societies, as far as I can tell, and so the role of women as practitioners of Sarah Animism is circumscribed to an extent that I wasn't initially aware of as an outsider. And so I'm trying to kind of make sense of it and trying to think about is gender therefore does it entail a hierarchy within society itself it would be important to speak of, right? And then what kind of a hierarchy is it exactly? What is the role of women? I know some scholars who have written on this specific question. I just haven't done the work yet, but in the complete project, I should speak to the hierarchies or systems of exclusion that may be part of the Sarah society, but then I would want to draw on the work of insiders, right, and not kind of commit the fault of a white feminist sort of, right, making claims from the outside. So it would need to be a collaborative project.
It may not be relevant because Senghor may not have been, in conversation with it, but I'm an early modern historian of science, and in my field we've kind of rewritten the story on animism versus mechanism in the early modern period by paying attention to the role of alchemy, which was a shared tradition across Islam, Christianity, much of North Africa, Eurasia, etc. And in the alchemical tradition, humans have a God-given obligation to grow the universe, to perfect nature. And one of the interesting things that happens, and this is an anti-scholastic largely tradition, so it would be not what Temples was thinking about. But that is not to say that alchemy is not colonial, because one of the interesting things that happens is that it is alchemy that provides early capitalist thought with a lot of its ideas about perpetual growth. So I just wanted to bring that to the table, that someone like Temples might be wanting to see scholastic philosophy as important to the Belgian rubber economy, but maybe it wasn't as important as he thought, and maybe other ideas about growth were more important. And that brings me to a question about diminishment, because what does change from alchemy's transition into kind of economic thought is this idea that perpetual growth is coming at someone else's diminishment is what happens. And it wasn't clear to me from the account of Senghor's view of animism how diminishment happens, because we heard how growth happens and how it can share across the entire system, but not letting diminishment happen to you, and whether there is a moral valence to diminishing some other force in the universe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Vera, for these questions. And it's a fascinating connection that I myself haven't explored, and perhaps we can have a conversation, about possible connections between like the European and the West African perspectives on animism and alchemy, and this idea of like an obligation to grow nature and how it could be co-opted by colonialism, right? Despite Senghor's sort of situating it in West African realities in a way that seems to offer like a counterpoint to colonialism rather than complicity with it. I understand Senghor to be not necessarily promoting perpetual growth for its own sake, but advocating for a responsible, engaged humanity. So I think that his emphasis on augmenting force is really a call to his own people to not be crushed by colonial forces, to not sort of resign themselves into into a nihilistic or depressive mindset. Senghor himself suffered from depression. He writes about this, and so he struggled himself to sometimes get out of bed and to feel active, right? Feel, alive. And so I think that there is like a moral plea behind all this talk about augmenting forces to Africans, especially. To remain engaged, to not fall prey to nihilism. But you're absolutely right. So diminishment, I guess, would, like from a humanistic standpoint, would be translatable into something like resignation, like apathy. And I think that that Senghor is sort of wary of this, like both psychic and political kind of inclination, which I think for him is very dangerous. So that's all I have, on like augmenting and diminishing your force. But I think you're absolutely right that I should think also about possible, connections to capitalism and by extension colonialism, as this kind of story of perpetual growth. So I'll give it more thought, and I appreciate the question.
I think we can go for just a few more minutes. I know some people need to leave, so please go ahead and step out. Yeah. Do you need to go as well?
No.
Okay. And then we probably have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. This was very, very interesting. So I have one very simple question, another one, and then some more broader thoughts. So what is vital force in the original?
La force vitale.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the other question I had was, did he have children?
Yes.
He did, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, you mentioned at the very end that he was brought up Catholic in some ways, and I wasn't surprised at all because I sort of heard it everywhere. The importance of the feminine, the vessel, and then you said prayer, but it's not just prayer, the sacrifice and the voluntary sacrifice, also going a little bit back to what you said, seems to be very important. And I couldn't help but notice 2 things. Maybe it's not so, but maybe it is so. In his kingdom of childhood, I really could hear reverberate, "Let the children come to me," because only they can come into the kingdom. And then in that fairy tale with the man and the boli, I guess the boli was the figure.
The statue, yes.
The statue,
Which,
and then the woman. And then suddenly life was given back to the woman. I don't know. I was also thinking, because which which agency was given to whom from whom, and I mean, that was in a way a self-sacrifice of the woman, and not diminishing someone else, but actually sacrificing yourself voluntarily. I just also thought there is a backdrop of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and Mary. I don't know. And just because you mentioned that, I don't know, Janice Splett or Spleet had thought about this. I don't know. I thought there was a lot of that in the whole. I don't know. Thought universe of thought, or yeah.
Yeah, the story is actually so it's one of traditional stories told by Amadou Koumba and written down by Birago Diop, and then Senghor is engaging with these stories and he's kind of analyzing them philosophically. So I believe the story is meant to be a reflection of the animist culture without any impact of Catholicism, just because there wouldn't have been in the context of the the storytelling itself, right? Of course, and Senghor's mother was Catholic and he himself officially was Catholic, so we can expect various elements of syncretism there, just as much as the Catholic religion itself perhaps is syncretic, right, with traditions that are much more earthly and where sacrifice is, of course, part of the doctrine, but it's understood in its more kind of spiritualized way, right? We talk about the Eucharistic elements rather than actually, right, blood and flesh, right, being sort of shared during the communion, right? For what it's worth, and it would be an interesting conversation to have to what extent Catholicism is animism as well, right? There's the syncretism there. I think is fascinating, and being raised Catholic, I never actually thought about the centrality of the sacrifice in the religion I'm still recovering from. So so these are all fascinating connections. I guess maybe that's all I'll say for the sake of time. Ilya is, I think.
Okay. We can all, some of us can all talk more later.
And I'm happy to stick around and talk if folks have time.
Yeah, my question is kind of motivated by actually Miguel's concern earlier, or like the question of there's only one inside, like one soul per individual. So it's a question about individuality, and also what seems to be a kind of emphasis on like what you say at the end, energetic reciprocity. And so my question is sort of like, what happens when like there are spirits or when there are vital forces that are not energetically reciprocities, but also like are there instances in Senghor of like energetic struggle or combat? And I'm thinking of like Igbo philosophy or Igbo land, and like the idea in like Nigerian thought of like the Obanye as like trickster spirits. So like we see like in Things Fall Apart, for example, Chinua Achebe's novel. Like the idea of is that Obanye sort of inhabit the bodies of like infants or children, and they have this kind of will or agency to die, to return to a kind of spirit cohort of dead, undead spirits. So they kind of wreak havoc, and they sort of repeat, they're repeaters, right? They sort of come again, and they can enact sort of stillborn deaths, they can enact like early childhood death. There's this fabulous Nigerian poet and thinker, writer, Kweki Emezi, who gives this account of what we would call gender dysphoria, but this idea that multiple spirits are actually like within one individual, and some of those spirits are trying to like self-sacrifice their host or that individual at the sort of, right? And so like when we think of sacrifice, thinking about like gender transition is like literally cutting off body parts or like mutations, right? And so I'm thinking about like, are there examples, basically just in Senghor, where it isn't this sort of picture of energetic reciprocity, but energetic struggle or combat? Is that possible? Is that possible if there's only sort of, in this humanistic picture of vital forces, there's only one per individual? Can there be multiple that are maybe at odds, or maybe those wills are
okay. So I think thank you, that's a wonderful question, and I guess from the presentation that I give, it may sound like Senghor offers this very sanitized, harmonious story, right, of how everything is interconnected and how we should celebrate, cherish, and practice, right, this inner connectivity. What comes to mind is like, is an example of more, say, pernicious or agonistic forces is of course the figure of the witch or a bad spirit, a haunting spirit, which does not participate in an exchange in a harmonious, stabilizing manner, but in a disruptive one, right? I think it's also important to recognize that. I was talking about the Boli, and in a longer version of the talk, I talk more about kind of the process of making it and the autonomy of these, previously called fetishes, now referred to in anthropology as power objects, right? Because these objects, are protective spirits. They take care of you, but they also demand not only sacrificial offerings, but they may demand that your sexual habits change, right, for the sake of the power object, right? So they can have this controlling a kind of agency, and once the master who makes the power object pronounces the formula that activates the power object, then it has a will of its own, right? And it's no longer subject to human control. Right, and then how it controls you and what demands it makes, is up to it, right? And so, I was reading reports of folks who have had the Boli, commissioned one, had it made for them by the master, right? And then they complain that the demands of the Boli are exonerous, right? You have to feed it, you have to you spend so much money on on the upkeep, right, of your power object. So I feel like there is definitely some ambivalence in the way in which these forces operate, and I think I haven't perhaps spoken too specifically to the question of combat, conflict, and so on. I don't find it to be like a theme running through Senghor's own work. The focus there is on integration, on unity, right? On humans, connecting with one another across the globe, humans connecting with the animal realm, the plant realm, the earth, right? It's a very earth-centric orientation. So I think he's probably a philosopher of harmonizing forces. I think that would be like the commandment, that we can find in his morally oriented in writings. But acknowledging everything that you said, I think is important as well. It would probably just mean like working with, several authors, several sources, and not just, his own understanding of force ontology.